You know, some say that fear is rising in some communities as Trump's latest immigration crackdown pushes some families deeper into the shadows. Schools, workplaces, even hospitals are feeling the ripple effects. What happens when policy meets people caught in the middle? Stick around to hear what our panelists have to say. Welcome to Faith and Politics, a show dedicated to discussing issues surrounding the intersection of church, state, and politics, and the examination of the question of, is your faith shaping your politics, or are your politics shaping your faith? In other words, what do you do when God and government come face to face? I'm your host, Orlin Johnson. Let me introduce you to our guest panelists that we have with us today. First, we have Ms. Jennifer Woods, who's the General Counsel and Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Lake Union Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. We also have Dr. Amilcar Grosso Jr., a pastor, an attorney, a professor of philosophy, theology, and law at Washington Adventist University. We also have with us Mr. Vilo Weiss, who's with the Indiana Conference and Director of the Public Affairs and Religious Liberty Department. And lastly, we have Dr. Wilmer Leon, a nationally syndicated columnist and a regular contributor to national and international television news programs and newspapers. Great having you guys here. Looking forward to really delving into these topics today. There's some people who believe that Donald Trump's anti-immigration agenda is forcing some Christians into the shadows and others to take their work underground. Some Christians in the United States have reportedly stopped attending public services out of justifiable fear of being apprehended or deported, while other denominations are taking steps to protect programs that could draw the ire of the administration or its allies. For example, we have a number of individuals who have reported through religious news services that some churches have seen attendance fall sharply or have had to even cancel services outright because of parishioners' fears about the administration's what some people call an authoritarian crackdown. You know, Wilma, when I take a look at what's going on, and I understand that we've got laws regarding immigration, and no one wants to be in a position where you're encouraging anybody to break the law, but there used to be times where there were places that were considered to be, safe havens just because it was more than just immigration, but sometimes it was just doing the right thing or maybe looking out for the least of these. But it looks like what we have here is a crackdown that's starting to really almost cause individuals who may even be here legally to feel fear of being out in the open. And I'm just wondering, where do you think this is all going to take us? And is there a better way maybe we can manage through this process?
Well, I think first, Orlin, we have to look at what's really the basis of this. And I think the basis of this is just very simply, it's racist. And the president and his minions have basically boiled their rhetoric down to one of the least common denominators, and that is the fear of others. And so you listen to the language of the Mexicans are coming across our borders, they're bringing drugs, and they're rapists and they're criminals. You've got Haitians that are eating people's dogs and cats in Springfield, Ohio. And now Congresswoman Ilhan Omar is garbage. And so when that becomes the basis of your rhetoric, one can only assume that you're really, again, playing down to the least common denominator. Trump was telling us that he wants to deport the worst of the worst. But even ICE data tells us that 72% of the people that have been detained have no criminal convictions. So he's looking for an easy policy to implement, an easy target to focus on, and a group of individuals that will have the hardest time in this country pushing back.
No, Vilo, you're a guy who's originally from the Texas area where there's always a lot of questions regarding immigration, but you're also an individual who does a lot of work in the faith arena as well, and probably have seen that there's people who are actually a little bit nervous about even coming to churches nowadays.
Oh, that's absolutely true. It's happening in our churches here in Indiana. I work very closely with our cultural ministries director, and we're always looking for church homes for our immigrant churches. And yes, it's making a huge difference. There's a lot of fear, and I think in addition to racism too, that Dr. Leon mentioned, I think you also have some concerns about the prior administration's immigration policies. I think that is fueling it too. We're a country of immigrants. My both of my grandmothers were immigrants. They didn't have to have lawyers to become immigrants, become citizens rather. And we've strayed a long ways from our roots, I'm afraid.
Amilcar, when I take a look at what's going on and you try to find out what is the best way to be doing things from a legal perspective, but in the same breath, there was a certain compassion that we were known for in our country that seems like it's kind of fallen by the wayside. And in the biblical aspects of looking out for the least of these, and dare I say, the Bible actually uses the word foreigner. It makes you wonder if anything you do nowadays is just viewed as being political. And as a result thereof, there's almost nowhere to go without finding yourself having to pick a side.
Yeah, and we're just lacking basic common sense. That first period, compassion, even going a further step, right? But myself being an immigrant, I am a documented immigrant to this country, coming from a family of immigrants, first from Germany to Brazil, and then from Brazil here to America. Even though we certainly, as you mentioned before, Erling, even though we certainly believe that laws must be uplifted and enforced, when immigration policy reaches the point where people are too afraid to show up to worship, in spite of the circumstances, that becomes more than a political debate. As a pastor, I hear reports of congregations that are canceling services, attendance dropping, families staying home because they're just afraid. They simply cannot go to church because that could put them in the government's radar. So even though there's no law that prevents people from worshiping in this country, actually quite the opposite of that, fear has some practical effect as a ban. They won't go to worship, even though there's no law. So when a church becomes a place to avoid rather than a place to seek, something has really gone wrong.
Yeah, and I see that as, it's become a religious liberty issue. But even before that, even before people were scared to go to churches, we had these infringements of people's civil liberties, right? Due process not being respected. And, there's clearly an interplay between religious liberty and civil liberty. And so when we see one being infringed upon, it is a detriment to the other as well. And I will say that, this is a time when religious communities of faith have to step up, have to say something, have to be vocal. And there have been many faith communities that have done that have issued statements, that have made themselves welcoming places for those who feel like they don't have a voice, and including, my own union that has issued a statement, of course, supporting the immigrant, talking about compassion, talking about human dignity. And I think that we need more of that. We need for people to be vocal, because so many who are in this situation of living in fear, they don't have a voice right now. They don't feel like they have a voice. And so those of us who have a voice, we need to use it to speak up when we see injustices occurring, when we see people who are scared to go to churches or to synagogues or to places where they can express their religion with others of their same faith tradition.
And whatever your position might be about immigration policies, religious liberty should not become collateral damage in the process of legitimately enforcing the law.
And the irony of this, Wilmer, is that there were more people deported under Obama, more people who were deported under Biden than were deported under Trump in his first term, or even what's going on in his second term. So it wasn't a matter that immigration policy wasn't working, but it seems now that it's taken on a new tone, and that tone seems to be the real issue of what's happening, as opposed to even the actual policy being enforced in a certain way.
Which is why I say to people all the time that we shouldn't get distracted by this Trump mania, because a lot of this policy is not administration policy, it's American foreign policy. And one of the big issues that gets overlooked, Nobody asks the question, why are people coming from Guatemala to the United States? Why are people coming from Nicaragua to the United States? Why are people coming from Honduras? And they don't look at the American policy towards those countries that has decimated the economies in those countries. Nobody asks, well, what impact did NAFTA have on Mexico corn production? Why are so many Mexicans coming to the United States? If they had a viable economy in their own country, don't you think they would stay home? The answer is probably more yes than no. But because of American foreign policy in those countries, we have created the circumstance that is forcing a lot of those individuals to flee their countries looking for higher ground.
But you know, Vilo, I guess that's where the rubber meets the road. We've got clear policies and laws that exist in our country regarding how immigration should take place. And I think it's fair to say that most of us know that immigration operates in many different tracks. And so the question is, how do you do this in a way in which you are, quote unquote, given a level playing field for everyone that's looking to be in the process, but in the same breath, finding out a compassionate way to maybe deal with these issues? And it seems like that's the real issue. We can't seem to find that perfect line in the middle on how to handle this.
That's absolutely true, because we need a process to deal with those that have come here without the proper authorization, but we don't have it. People come here for a reason. Certainly there's foreign policy issues, but there's also the issue that a lot of people see America as a place of freedom.
Yeah.
As well.
Yeah.
And so we need a reasonable process to deal with those that are here illegally, to get them on a citizenship track. But nobody talks about that. And Congress, I think, to a large degree, has dropped the ball on immigration.
You know, Milker, what's really interesting, and this is kind of like the conversation nobody wants to have, is that our immigration policies impact our economic development in our country in ways that no one wants to talk about. You know, there are groups of people who do work in this country that make this country what it is, that if you decide that you want to start causing them to be concerned about going to work, we could find the economic development engine of our country come screeching to a halt. And I think that's one of the other issues we don't like to talk about. That's the reality of what's really going on as well.
Yeah, and it becomes much easier for you to adopt a rhetoric that will cause and work and play on that division and those bumper sticker lines that don't have the depth of the discussion that will consider the humanity of each individual that is involved in those climates, the families that are impacted. So not only policies, good policies, but also how to apply those policies in a humane, compassionate way. That's maybe what we're lacking right now.
Yeah, and I have to let that be the last word, because that seems to be the balance that we're trying to find some days, but then it also seems to be the balance that some of us are trying not to find. I think Wilmer kind of pointed it out, that sometimes this is all about agenda, and this is not about anything more, but hopefully we can get to a place where we can find a balanced point of view and deal with this in a way that's great for not only individuals, but also for our country. Coming up, Alaska Airlines supports a proposed bill that would threaten the religious liberty rights of certain citizens. Don't go away. We'll be right back. When faith and government collide, the issues can be complex and consequential. Faith in Politics explores how religious conviction intersects with law, policy, and public life, offering depth, balance, and clarity, with meaningful discussion and trusted insight. To see a bunch of our previous episodes, check us out at faithandpolitics.tv and subscribe to us on YouTube. You know, there's a case that's called Brown versus Alaska Airlines, where many Americans have concerns over the potential impact of the so-called Equality Act, a bill considered by Congress that would seriously threaten the religious liberty rights of any citizen who dissents from the government's sexual orthodoxy. So divisive is this legislation that it's languished for months in the U.S. Senate without any votes that have been taken to pass it. In early 2021, Alaska Airlines announced its support for the Equality Act on a company forum inviting employees to comment and ask questions. A flight attendant named Lacey Smith posted a question asking, as a company, do you think it's possible to regulate morality? Both clients were subsequently investigated, questioned by airline authorities, and then fired from their jobs. You know, Jennifer, this seems to be exactly what we are getting concerned with. We have a situation where a public forum is now requesting you to engage. Then you engage based on what you believe your thoughts are. And then after you engage, they tell you, wrong answer, you're fired. You know, this is one of those kind of cases where on one hand you say, maybe a little common sense could have been used and we could have gotten to, you know, a copacetic reasoning on this. But it seems as though that's not what people want anymore. It's not even about right or wrong. It's more about you're not with me, therefore I've got to be against you. And that seems what we have going on here.
Yeah, I mean, the fact that Alaska Airlines has this forum and says, hey, share your views, but make sure that your views align with our views, right? That seems to be what's happening here. And the fact that these two individuals are fired for sharing their views and, you know, views that they say are religiously held views, when others were able to also share comments that were offensive to these individuals and hurtful and not face repercussions, it shows that, you know, Alaska Airlines probably didn't use the common sense in how they did all of this, right? The easiest thing to have done would have been to not have a forum. If you only want to hear one side, then don't allow people to share their views or ask questions. And they didn't go that route. So here they are, and they're faced with this lawsuit. And, you know, I don't think that the facts are necessarily in their favor on this one.
While reading about the case, I just felt like we're in a bizarre world, you know, that alternative reality. What actually followed that situation was a breakdown of workplace fairness, basic fairness. The union mocked the women, called them names, and then reported them to management. The union did that. And just to make things worse, the company moved quickly. That's sometimes not wise. And they moved quickly in the wrong direction. Not to protect civility, but to discipline the speakers that were called to give their opinion. So they were investigated, interrogated, and ultimately fired. Well, it's in the Ninth Circuit, I believe, right now. It hasn't been decided. But the bigger issue is already visible here. Can a workplace have open dialogue if only one viewpoint is safe to express? Because if expressing a thoughtful, conscience-based question leads to being fired, that's not diversity, that's uniformity, that's enforced by fear.
Wow, you know, Leon, what kind of struck me was I had a flashback that it was my mother and I having a conversation, and I didn't realize it was a rhetorical question. You know, I thought they were actually waiting for a response, and this seems like that situation where the forum was just rhetorical. We really didn't want you to say anything in it, because the moment you do, you realize you violated what we were trying to do here.
Well, two things along that line. One is, to your point, except it was my father, I thought we were having a dialogue, and then I realized I was listening to a diatribe. And you know, and the other one is when I want to know your opinion, I'll give you one.
Right.
In looking at all of this, I really wondered, why is this even in the sphere or context of religion in the first place? Because fairness and humanity and respect, that all transcends religion. That's just the fundamental elements of being human. This didn't even have to go into the religious sphere. This is just a matter of respect for human beings as human beings. And so what problem does Alaska Airlines have with that?
You know, Vilo, what really kind of struck me is the idea that you decide to create a forum which gives the impression that you're looking for some type of back and forth. And then the moment the back and forth begins, then you realize that wasn't what you were looking for. But it just begs the question, what were they hoping to accomplish with this? The question that was posed of whether or not you can legislate morality, I think we've all asked ourselves that question 100 times with the idea and the concept that you can't put policies in place to make people do what you want them to do. And, and even, God allows us to choose to do wrong. And so that's what kind of really confused me. I couldn't figure out what were they hoping to accomplish with this?
Well, I wondered the same thing, especially when they ended up getting tossed. And then I was especially alarmed by the union, which you generally would expect to be supporting its members, and they want to toss them in a well somewhere. It seems like we're going back 100 years or more, with the way some things were done. So that really concerned me that they weren't more supportive of that. I would rather Congress deal with this issue. Now, granted, the House has passed it several times. It hasn't got out of the Senate, but I would rather Congress amend the Civil Rights Act than what Supreme Court did to some degree in Bostock, because I don't like legislation from the bench.
Yeah.
This country needs to be everybody needs to be treated fairly and respectfully in this country, regardless of where they are on spectrums.
Jennifer, there's a group of people who have pushed back on the Equality Act and had something called fairness for all. An idea that was a little bit more balanced method that maybe had, quote unquote, better policies, better language and things of that nature. But it seems as though fairness for all seems to be on the bench as well. Nothing seems to be moving in this particular forum and anything happening in Congress at all on this.
Yeah, I think it just shows how much people do not want to touch this issue. And I think that's the wrong approach, right? Congress does need to, they need to address this, right? And I think that fairness for all was a much better way of handling it. It wasn't a zero-sum game. You had people on both sides coming together to say, how can we make this a win-win? How can we respect each other and respect the rights of the LGBTQ community while still respecting the rights of the religious community as well? And I think that's a much better approach than saying, hey, if you are not respectful of the LGBTQ community or you want someone to respect your religious rights, then you're not part of this discussion. Like, that's what the Equality Act is doing here. And we're seeing that kind of play out in how these two women were treated by expressing their views. I don't think that's the way we want to go forward as a nation. And I'm hoping that we are able to have this conversation soon and come to an arrangement where all rights are being respected and not just the rights of certain individuals.
And that's just another great example of ideals that are really well thought for and projected, but then when they meet reality, they fall short, which goes back to the root of the issue, which is a societal breakdown that we're facing right now, of trust being broken and hyperpolarization that we're facing, the healing of those basic community-oriented activities to bring people together to the table in families, having meals together, having a conversation, building communication in a positive way. That is a pathway towards healing because it won't come top down. And we're facing a moment when employers say that they want inclusion, they want equality, but sometimes they treat different perspectives and in a very special way to our hearts, religious viewpoints as unwelcome or even dangerous. So a workplace that shuts down your sincere, conscience-based speech isn't protecting harmony. It's just creating anxiety and silencing people.
Orland, the discussion about fairness for all is a great conversation because where we find ourselves now under this ideological rhetoric of make America great again, which is really reactionary, and it is taking us back to a time when the country was not diverse, when the country was not inclusive. And that is unfortunately the direction that a lot of mindsets in this country are headed. So that's why there's such a pushback on fairness for all. Who would be against fairness for all? That's what we were taught as children, to share and to be fair. But no, we have to go back to make America great again when, at least for me, as an African American male, I don't know that America ever was such.
Well, you know, Vilo, one of the things that I'm really trying to help to understand is there's this viewpoint that if you can be compassionate to a group of people in which you don't agree with their lifestyle, that somehow that means that there is an acceptance. You know, the idea that you can be compassionate to someone who's engaging in something that you don't agree with automatically means that now you are, quote unquote, now part of their view. It just seems to me that there is a nuanced position that you can have. You know, I mean, Christ could be in a position where you hate the sin, but still love the sinner. But the idea is you can't be compassionate to someone that may not be living your lifestyle unless people think that's because you want to be part of them.
Well, we see Exhibit A of that in the way Jesus dealt with Mary Magdalene.
Mm-hmm.
You know, he didn't agree with her lifestyle, but he loved her. He cared for her. He treated her respectfully. He didn't put her down, and he appeared to her first after he was resurrected.
I'm gonna have to let that be the last word, but understanding that you can love an individual regardless of what's going on in their life and find yourself still being someone who can help to shape their future. And I think if we spend more time loving our fellow men and wanting to shape their future with love, we will probably end up getting much better results in the short run and in the long run. Hey, Jennifer, tell me something I don't know.
Sure. So we were just talking about Alaska Airlines. And did you know that Alaska Airlines was actually the first U.S. airline to offer online checking?
Didn't know that. Vilo, tell me something I don't know.
You know, we talk about Lady Liberty there in the harbor at New York City. You know, it appears that she may have been modeled after an Egyptian woman, because the sculptor was inspired by the large colossal figures guarding Nubian tombs.
Wow, didn't know that. Amilcar, tell me something I don't know.
Orland, did you know that in my native country of Brazil, we have some of the world's largest immigrant communities from different countries? We have the largest Japanese community outside of Japan with more than 2 million people. In Sao Paulo, you can hear Portuguese mixed with Japanese in a neighborhood called Liberdade, Liberty. And the city has over 600 Japanese restaurants. And that also applies to the Lebanese, Syrian communities, Italian, Portuguese, Spanish, and even the second largest ancestry of German and Jewish communities within Latin America.
Wow, didn't know that. Wilmer, tell me something I don't know.
Well, and to that point, the largest community of Africans outside the continent are in Brazil. And if Lady Liberty is actually patterned after an Egyptian, we have to check her papers, and I think she's going to have to be deported.
Thanks for that. Great conversation today. Looking forward to doing it again soon. And thank you again for being here with you. Hope you enjoyed our conversation. Just remember, if it's about God and government, it's faith and politics. See you next time.